Towards the very end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, we see a tremendous rise in popular uses of photography. Let's look at what some of those photographs look like. Just to define some terms here, when we're talking about vernacular photography, we're talking about photographs that were made for personal use. So we've already seen a lot of portraits made for personal use. This begins with the daguerreotype and continues right up to this time. But at the end of the 19th century, we see the beginning of snapshot photography. Vernacular photography also includes souvenir photography, photographs that people collected for household and personal use. Major changes in the 1880s up to 1900 put photography in the hands of more and more people. It was easier to use and it became much less expensive, so it was much, much more widespread than it had ever been before. Increasingly affordable and accurate printing processes made photography a dominant element of consumer culture, so it became part of advertising and the circulation of commerce and industry. So in the 1880s, you see the rise of dry plate cameras. Dry plate negatives are better than wet plate negatives because the plates can be stored dry. So they're transported very easily and stored very easily. They become more accessible and less expensive. One of the ways that people use dry plate negatives is at tourist locations. People who came there to visit could get one of these souvenir cameras, take one picture with a negative that was inside of the camera, and leave the camera there for the site to process and then mail them the photographs. So that's one of the ways that it was used. But things changed tremendously with the rise of the career of George Eastman and the creation of the Kodak Company. So in 1881, George Eastman, who is a young professional at that time, creates the Eastman Dry Plate Company in Rochester, New York. And eventually he changes the name of the company to Kodak, which is a word that doesn't mean anything per se. He just really liked the way that it sounded. So in 1888, he creates the first Kodak camera and manufactures it to distribute and sell to the public. The first Kodak camera contains a 20-foot roll of negative paper. So these are paper negatives that people can take through this camera. It makes for 100 very small circular pictures. And the following year, the cameras begin to use roll film, gives you a much sharper image. So Kodak was a modern way of doing business using mass production, mass marketing, and bold branding. And one of their strokes of genius was to innovate with this slogan, "You push the button, we do the rest." So here's George Eastman, a photograph of him using one of his cameras. So this photograph was taken with one of his cameras, but he's also posing with one of his cameras. So that's George Eastman in the middle there. It's a very cleverly constructed, actually really beautifully constructed photograph. Look at the repeated elements of circles in the portholes that line up behind George Eastman. Look how he's sort of lined up the camera in his hand so that it's almost right in the center of the picture, but his face is directly above it, so it like leads your eyes directly towards him at the middle. Now, since these cameras were very, very simple boxes, they didn't have viewfinders, and you couldn't compose the image in the back of the camera like you could with the traditional view cameras that had been used up until this time. So they're really doing a lot of guessing with composition with these cameras. And that counts for the professionals just as much as for the amateurs that these cameras were marketed to. But because they used a wide angle lens and because they made this round image, you really couldn't go wrong. It had a fixed focus. You couldn't focus these cameras. Okay, so anything that was more than 4 feet away was going to be basically in focus. And they would really only work if you were photographing in sunlight. Otherwise, the light wouldn't be bright enough to get you much of an image. But this is about as good as these cameras could get. The textbook gives a few sort of pointers on what's really interesting going on in this photograph, but it uses the repeated elements of the circle, and it's showing him out there experiencing life out in the world rather than standing in a studio. So these were really exciting things for a photograph to be able to do, and it's in the hands of everyday people. So, yeah, everyday folks are able to buy these cameras, take them home, and once you've got one of these cameras, you don't really keep the camera. The camera is mailed back to Kodak with the negative inside of it, so the consumer never touches the negative. And that means that it's not there's no real margin of error for the consumer. They're not going to mess anything up. They take the pictures and they send it back to the company, and then the pictures come to them. Now, at the time that these cameras were first made, they were fairly expensive. It'd be kind of upper class people who would use it, but it was nowhere near as expensive as going to a portrait studio, and people had a lot of fun with these cameras. So, in the early years of the snapshot cameras, you see people sort of playing with them and taking kind of surprising photographs. So, a man on his balcony on the left, and a photograph just of the inside of an upper class person's house on the right. And you see pictures of people out having fun on their holidays, whether they're riding on one of these ships or out there on the beach. Because you could turn the camera in different angles, people were doing sort of fun and surprising things with composition as well. And it's really interesting to see the kinds of clothing that people are wearing and how they're interacting with each other, just really glimpsing what life is like at this time. And this is from 1888. So these are advertisements. The Kodak company advertised in newspapers and magazines, trying to reach people and trying to sort of rope them into this practice of photography, make it accessible as something that people could do for fun. This is just an example of the instructions that would have come with these early cameras, just trying to make it very easy for the consumer and very accessible for them. Things got even more accessible with the advent of the Brownie camera. So this was released in 1900, and it was created to be a gift that people could give to their children. It cost $1, and a dollar was worth more in 1900 than it's worth these days, but it was intended to be something that kids could use. So that gives you a sense of just how easy they expected it to be for people. Even a child could use it. The thing is that once it was this affordable and this easy, absolutely everybody wanted to do it. So while it was intended to market towards children, it ended up just really spiking the popularity of everyday popular photography and snapshot photography. One of the interesting things about the early years of Kodak is that they marketed specifically to women, and they marketed with images of women using their cameras. This particular photograph is from 1915, and it shows a later Kodak camera. So their cameras weren't all these simple brownies. Those were the most easy to use and inexpensive of their cameras, but they made other cameras too as the 20th century moved on. But their advertising really emphasized women holding their cameras because women were consumers of their cameras. Women were photographers who took pictures in their homes of their families, of their children, of their everyday lives, and Kodak marketed directly to them. Let's also consider another use of photography during this time, the photographic postcard. So we already know that stereo cards and cartes de visite had been widespread from the 1870s forward. With the rise of dry plate negatives in the 1880s, photography became even more inexpensive and widespread, and the U.S. Postal Service expanded its range and standardized its rates across the country. So postcards became popular to send and collect, and a way to communicate with one another in a casual and playful and fun kind of a way, starting in the 1880s and becoming even more popular through the 1890s and going on into the early 20th century. So we see photographs rising during this time that in the late part of the 19th century, they're printing these photographs as postcards. So they're direct photographic postcards. They're not produced with a printing press. They're produced as actual photographs. Themes in photographic postcards include travel, so souvenir postcards are super common, playful, humorous images and novelty images. Photographs are used to document newsworthy events and political figures and subjects of personal importance to specific areas and groups of people. There's also this phenomenon of what they call tall tale postcards that became popular after the means to make them became widely available. So here we see the rise of popularity of animal postcards. So we've got a kitty cat postcard on the left, dressing animals in costumes and making just fun, playful postcards out of them. It's not super serious. It's just a way for people to communicate with one another in a really casual way. They couldn't even do this by telephone yet. Okay, this is just a way for people to communicate casually and playfully through the mail. On the right-hand side, you see a photograph that was produced to advertise the services of this photographer that made photographic postcards. Couple of examples of photographic postcards. On the left, an example of a newsworthy event. This is documenting somebody who had gone over Niagara Falls in this barrel. It was something that people did at the time, sort of extreme sports, if you will. But this is a photographic postcard that documents this noteworthy news event of somebody going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. And if you look carefully at it, you can see that it was photographically manipulated. Okay, it was put together with multiple negatives and composited to be able to put the full image together. The picture on the right is even more obviously photographically manipulated. It's showing this a profitable crop of onions, vast overscaled onions, these kinds of photographic, playful photographic manipulations that showed giant agricultural achievements. They were a sort of a running joke in photographic postcards at this time. Here's a nice photographic Christmas card. This is from 1909 showing Santa Claus on a biplane. So this is photography treating the modern qualities of the world around them in a playful way as a means for people to connect with each other long distance.